This is a video we never wanted to make, and now calmly we'll try to explain why. Some of you may have seen the video that the channel Entropy for Life dedicated to one of our videos. Specifically, it's a short documentary in which we interviewed Professor Marco Ragusa about his book, The Unnatural Man. In this video, Giacomo Moro, according to his own statements, supposedly demonstrated Professor Ragusa's lack of preparation on some topics discussed in the book. To reach this conclusion, Moro creates what he calls a scientific reaction video. For many months, we remained silent, but not because we had nothing to say, but because we don't like this way of communicating. And we didn't want to fuel what could be politely called a debate, but which in reality would have another name. This makes our channel a tool for accusations, which we distance ourselves from in both method and content. It's needless to say that over the months we've received an endless number of insults, and we had to change our editorial plans. In fact, we had planned a series of interviews that we had to cancel for now due to the obvious consequences of what happened. After seeing that Giacomo Moro has published yet another video on the matter, we feel compelled to respond in order to try to clarify things and bring at least a bit of truth to this deplorable affair. We are fully aware that our response will add to what seems more like a dissing operation than scientific criticism, but we are obliged to make some necessary clarifications. The proceeding referred to in Moro's latest video has nothing to do with Professor Ragusa, with science, or with theories of evolution. After watching the latest video, we actually expected Moro to talk about our measure and what we were accusing him of. Mind you, not that we would have liked that. Instead, Moro makes a video in which he mentions the professor again, thus creating the misunderstanding that the measure is Ragusa's doing, which is not true. He also shows a conference clip from the internet where he accuses him of colluding with aliens. The overwhelming evidence, Ragusa dares to smile during a question asked by a lady in the audience. What we incredulously asked ourselves at the end of watching his long monologue is, but what does all this rambling have to do with what happened? Have we once again been used as a tool to draw attention back to Ragusa? Unfortunately, the answer is yes. We acknowledge this situation, which clearly has a specific purpose. But we'll come back to this later as well. Let's start at the beginning of the story. That is, since Entropy for Life published the first video. Now, given the previous events, we feel the need to make a second preliminary point. Moretto, listen carefully to what we're saying and focus. Everything we're going to say is just our opinion. It has nothing to do with the ideas, opinions, or hypotheses of Professor Ragusa. The professor, if he wishes, will respond in the ways and forms he considers most appropriate. Did you hear that clearly? Are you all witnesses? Good. So we take full responsibility. And we are ready to recite the through my fault, my most grievous fault. When creating an audiovisual product, whatever it may be, you identify the theme. You write a story outline, which will then develop into a treatment or screenplay. These first elements contain everything your product will address. After the first phase, you determine the medium for broadcasting the product and identify your target audience. Then you evaluate the production cost, the production capacity, and many other things. But we don't want to bore you, so let's get to the point. Of course, you already know the topic of the video. And the goal was to address a general audience, so people without specific knowledge about the topic, and to publish it first on our YouTube channel. During pre-production, we sent a small crew to do the filming. Once the set was prepared, we informed the professor about how we wanted to conduct the interview, the tone of communication we wanted to use, and the audience we were targeting. The professor was willing to meet our request, and in about 2.5 hours, the crew recorded the interview. And from this, we started the production of the 30-minute video. This premise, which may seem obvious to many, actually doesn't seem to be so. And this confirms once again how difficult it is to communicate with an audience that doesn't have specific expertise and confuses the different formats that audiovisuals can have. Now, clearly ours is an entertainment channel whose editorial line is to deal with topics that are at the edge of knowledge, and we try to do it in the most rational way possible. We also present the topics we cover in a way that can be understood by everyone, and we try to make our products enjoyable. To this, we add our own comments and delve deeper into the issues that are particularly important to us. For those who want to explore the topic further, we usually include the sources we use to make the video, which can be scientific studies, books, interviews, or other documentary works. In this specific case, the source was the book The Unnatural Man. So hoping to have clarified this point, let's take a look at Moro's reaction video. Unfortunately, the video will be long and will be divided into two parts. In the first part, we will focus on Moro's reaction video. Many have asked for our opinion on the criticisms against the professor, so we will limit ourselves to giving our opinion on some issues. In the second part, we will clarify the legal matter.
This is a rather special video, also because the main participant in this video is an associate professor.
Moro's video starts in an engaging way. Moro says he has conducted an in-depth investigation into the skills of the dangerous criminal Ragusa. He tells us that maybe he teaches at the University of Catania, although he's not sure. He says he has published scientific articles, so he appears to be a fully fledged academic.
He deals with a certain type of topics. These are all topics related to the so-called RNAs, in particular microRNAs, circular RNAs, and the various mechanisms that play a regulatory role within gene expression.
Moro shows us the scientific articles that have been published in the last year by the professor, but he points out that there are no publications related to human evolution or genetic analyses. A subtle way of saying that he doesn't have specific expertise in the subject, the first building block of an argument that is taking shape.
He doesn't have any publications that are in some way related to human evolution, nor any genetic analyses concerning human evolution.
Actually, to be precise, and as you'll find out, Moro likes to be precise, the professor has several publications on gene evolution, that is, the gradual continuous change of genetic sequences over time, which happens through mechanisms such as mutation, natural selection, genetic drift, and migration. But the twists in the professor's life aren't over yet. He tells us that he keeps bad company. Apparently, he was seen conspiring with a certain Moro Biglino, a dangerous character known for his stories. But despite this, he is considered a good professor by his students, and during his lessons he doesn't seem to show any signs of alien evangelization. At this point, he tells us that he will play our video and we will all watch it together in its entirety. Finally, we get to the heart of the video, and the first thing that stands out is the technique that Moro uses to make his case. The main goal of his remarks doesn't seem to be just to refute the theories presented in the video, but also to belittle the expertise of the video's main character. The technique used is very simple but highly effective, and basically consists of interrupting the other person and cutting them off. This is a common technique, it's nothing special, and we often see it used in political debates where two opponents interrupt each other, trying to prevent the other from making their argument or finishing a point. And to do this, they often introduce new elements into the debate or make clarifications, sometimes just for their own sake, with the aim of steering the discussion toward topics they consider more useful to support their own arguments. If this is the technique that we all see being used during these events, the technique used by Moro is similar but different in its content and objective. If during debates the goal is to prevent the other person from arguing and bringing evidence in support of their position, in the case of the video made by Moro, the goal is different. In fact, the purpose is not just to interrupt the other person while they are stating their arguments. Moro cannot modify or influence the line of thought of the person in front of him because he doesn't have a real person to debate with, but a recording. So the real purpose is something else, to project an image of authority. How does he do this? He interrupts the narration of the video and starts with what he himself calls nitpicky clarifications.
Yes, actually there's a mistake here, but it's fine. That's really just a nitpicky thing.
For those who don't know what puntiglioso means, a definition that conveys the meaning is a man who easily takes on an attitude of resentful or haughty stubbornness over trivial matters. Let's think about Omanini's explanation, for example, which Moro considers more precise as a definition. It's useless for the purposes of the narration, but it gives the listener the impression of competence, of in-depth knowledge of the facts, something that the person appearing in the video, on the other hand, does not show, because his speech seems simpler, more popular, less scholarly. But it's normal for it to be this way because the language used by the professor and even the editing of the video are calibrated for a completely different communicative register.
Probably. I don't know if you've seen it. If you haven't seen it, I invite you to watch it. There's a 27-minute video of mine.
Another reason also causes interruptions, especially at the start. Previous videos made by Moro are promoted, and in them he informs the audience that in the other videos on his channel, everything is explained in even more detail.
It's a video called Where Do We Come From? The Last 2 Million Years of Human Evolution, in which I try to talk about everything we know and also what we don't know.
This type of interruption has two clear objectives. The first, as we've seen, is to create an image of authority, with the subtext being, my interlocutor reduces everything to a single sentence. In fact, besides what I'm telling you right now, which is already much more than what you've heard, I want to let you know that on this topic, I've even made a 30-minute video where I add even more information. So just think about the difference in knowledge between me and the person in front of me. The second goal is clearly to promote one's own channel. And this brings us to the reasons why Moro decided to use our video. And even in this case, there are mainly two reasons. The first reason, as Moro himself admitted, is because our video had more than 500,000 views and thousands of interactions, and this gives him the opportunity to speak to this large audience. In fact, by making a so-called reaction video, the chances of this happening are higher. The audience who watched the previous video will recognize the video's thumbnail. But that's not all. The YouTube algorithm itself will be prompted to show this video to the audience who watch the video on our channel. So people will become curious to see Moro's reasons for challenging it, and they will be encouraged to click. This is also a technique that we all know very well and is very popular among influencers, and it has a big impact and high engagement because arguments, or dissing as it's trendy to call it today, always have a strong appeal to the public. And it doesn't really matter if we're dressing it up as science. The purpose is the same. That this is actually a goal is unintentionally confirmed by Moro himself when he somewhat awkwardly tries to justify himself by saying that he knows the professor wrote a book but wasn't able to find it.
He also wrote a book, The Unnatural Man. The Unnatural Man can't be found. I checked Amazon, and it's no longer for sale.
This feels like an improvised excuse, especially since we don't see why the book must be on Amazon. But if Moro is capable of searching for publications and scientific articles on the internet, it's hard to believe that his ability to browse the web would suddenly disappear, and he wouldn't be able to find where the book is being sold. And to think you don't need to be an expert, the book can be easily purchased on the publisher's website. We bought it there. Moro is actually counting on the fact that his followers won't verify this information. The more daring ones will go to Amazon and stop there. Only an infinitesimal part of them will go as far as the publisher's website. This, let's call it a non-truth, serves to solve a fundamental problem. Moro challenges the hypotheses of an author who wrote a book where he discusses his hypothesis in detail. But to do so, he doesn't use the book, as one would logically expect, where he would have found all the hypotheses and scientific references behind the ideas he was challenging and could have resolved any doubts. But instead, he uses only one interview as a reference for his response. But why only one? There are many online. Why did he fall in love with ours? Because if he had used more than one, the idea of a reaction video would have fallen apart, along with any potential benefits that could have come from it. But that's not all. He needed a summary of Ragusa's thoughts. He needed for his video exactly that summary he criticizes so much. He needed those simplifications that reduce complex thoughts to a few words, which clearly can't be exhaustive, but are useful for making a point. And he needed to find it ready-made. He couldn't make this summary himself, because if he had done so, he wouldn't have been able to use the technique of feigning incompetence. And then there's another huge contradiction in this whole thing. Moro clearly has no respect for our work. He says it explicitly on several occasions. But then, why does he use our work to judge the professor's expertise? Anyone with even a little familiarity knows that video editing can be a form of rewriting, and that it can determine the very meaning of what's being said. So, why does Moro suddenly trust us? For someone claiming to be making a scientific reaction video, all of this is embarrassing. First of all, because he's doing it without even having read the work he's about to criticize, but above all, because he's trusting the summary work of someone he doesn't respect, and even considers incapable. What's left of the much acclaimed scientific rigor in all this? Nothing. But it doesn't matter. He knows that the general public prefers blood over concrete objections, and no one will challenge him on this, or at least the majority won't. Now let's take the case of bipedalism and upright posture. Moro bores us for dozens of minutes on this topic. He suggests people can't distinguish bipedalism from upright posture and repeatedly names all bipedal living beings. And he deliberately ignores the fact that in the video, for the reasons we've already told you, this whole concept was simplified as complete human bipedalism, in contrast with animal bipedalism.
Complete bipedalism is a unique feature.
If his reference had been the book, he would never have been able to do any of this. Because in the book, the arguments are clearly more extensive and in-depth, as well as including references to various scientific publications. Or if he had found elements to dispute in the book, everything would have been infinitely more complex, because he would have had to contradict an argument laid out over several pages of text and bibliographic references.
The term loss is wrong. We simply thinned out our fur. We still have a bit of hair, but that's fine. This is something.
Here too, it starts with a rather unhelpful criticism. The term loss is being disputed. It would be more accurate to use thinning of the fur, because the hairs have become thinner and smaller, but it's a pity that shortly after, the same Moro uses the term loss of fur and struggles not to repeat the same simplification throughout the rest of the video. And this proves, if there was any need, the uselessness of his previous correction, which apparently is harmless. But it aims to create in the viewer the idea of authority instead of misunderstanding.
The loss of fur came a bit. The loss of fur, the loss of the fur, the thinning of the fur came later, and
the discussion about fur continues, and the professor states that there can be multiple reasons why this happened, including, for example, sexual selection, although it seems that this explanation doesn't really convince him. At this point, Moro intervenes again, and what does he do? He states that the reasons why human body hair thinned out can be multiple. He presents a study that suggests differences among parasites infesting the head, body hair, and genital areas may, perhaps along with other factors, have contributed to all this. After saying this, he also talks about possible sexual selection and states that even he is not fully convinced by this last hypothesis.
in the same way, it's plausible. I don't think this is the explanation, but there would be nothing strange if the loss of body hair had been selected through sexual selection.
So after another 10 minutes, we're back to square one. The discussion hasn't moved an inch. We've only heard possibilities. And it can't be otherwise because there are no certainties on the subject. At the moment, there are probable reconstructions and hypotheses. And what does Moro do at this point? He pulls a rabbit out of the hat that supposedly settles the debate: aliens.
So aliens, right? There's always this thing. This is a pretty typical thing.
All of this, once again, served to fuel that perception of authority. The discussion was expanded, details were added, but without adding anything that actually resolves the issue. And in addition, the idea was added that if we question all these reconstructions, then there's only one possibility: aliens. Finally, after many minutes, we get to something more concrete. In the video, they talk about how the upright posture and the big head typical of our species can put reproduction at risk. In specific cases like this, it endangers not only the life of the newborn during childbirth and the following stages, but also the life of the mother herself. Here, Ragusa points out how the death of the mother can be a problem for the continuation of the species. If a newborn dies, another can be made. If the mother dies, this isn't possible.
When being prolific leads to the death not only of the child but also of the mother, it is one of those aspects that could spell doom from the outset.
Now, this is certainly not an invention of Ragusa. It's a well-known and fascinating topic that many researchers have explored, because the underlying concept is why this trait has been favored by selection. Is the possible cognitive advantage that can come from having a large brain enough to explain it? Let's also remember that a large brain is not necessarily a synonym for intelligence. What really matters are the quantity and quality of neural connections. If that weren't the case, animals with huge brains like whales would be extremely intelligent. But let's get back to our main topic. As we were saying, there are truly a lot of studies on this subject. And the issue is widely debated because the topic is very complex and fascinating. But Moro seems to have it all figured out. And once again, he uses the technique of interrupting to dig deeper. But this time, something incomprehensible comes out of it.
Here, there's a pretty big misunderstanding. The basic idea is more or less correct.
Let's pay attention to the words. Moro isn't saying that what the professor is saying at that moment is correct, but more or less right. Even if the professor is saying something that's really hard to claim isn't true, it's important to point out that this is not the case. Ragusa is always close to the revealed truth, but he doesn't fully know it. To contradict what Ragusa says, Moro repeats in a more detailed way what the professor has just said. So it's not clear what's incorrect, but he does add an interesting element.
That's true, but we should pause to consider the percentage of mortality involved. Because if we were talking about mortality rates of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 10%, then from an evolutionary point of view, it would actually be something very peculiar.
Here, Moro starts with a bunch of nonsense that becomes proof of how they're trying to manipulate the conversation. Only this time, as we'll see, everything goes wrong, and the result is just a big mess. Or rather, it's proof that this whole rebuttal video is based on nothing, not because of what is being said, which in this case seems inaccurate, but because of the way it's being done. So let's take a step back to understand better. Let's remember that the professor, while presenting the book's theses, is facing a small crew pointing 2 cameras at him, the lights, and an interviewer pressing him. Ragusa is speaking off the cuff. He can only rely on his memory and his speaking skills. He has no way to check anything if his memory fails him on a specific detail. It's also important not to underestimate the fact that, in order for the interview to be effective, the interviewer must at least try to challenge the arguments of the person in front of him. We can therefore say that Ragusa's situation is not comparable to the situation Moro is in. In fact, his is a comfortable situation. He is recording in his studio, he can stop the recording whenever and however he wants, and he can look into and verify the data he mentions. But despite this, we notice that things are not going well. Moro, still with the intention of interrupting and contradicting what he's hearing, claims that the mortality of mothers is not decisive in perpetuating the species. And to do so, he cites WHO data on the mortality rate in the African continent for the year 2020. And he states that it averages about 1 in 1,000.
The fact is that, as terrible as deaths during childbirth are, they are still on the order of 1 in 1,000. Look, I was looking at WHO data from different parts of the world. For example, in the poorest countries, it's usually less than 1 death per 1,000 during childbirth.
But what would this prove? How can you compare current mortality with that of 200,000 years ago? It's clearly a cognitive bias, useful to support his thesis. At this point, we could do what Moro does and quote the WHO report that we find on the Institute of Health's website, which states that in the 20-year period between 2000 and 2020, mortality has globally decreased by 34%. And it went from 339 deaths to the current 223 per 100,000 live births. To better understand the trend in mortality, we can once again refer to the data available on the website of the Istituto Superiore della Sanità, where we read that in 1990, so just 34 years ago, 546,000 women died each year from childbirth, compared to 287,000 in 2020, so almost double. And this was just 34 years earlier. So what kind of mortality rate could there have been 200,000 years ago? Clearly, we can't know that. We don't have concrete evidence to go that far back in time. However, an interesting fact comes from ancient Rome. Several researchers have tried to understand what kind of mortality affected women during childbirth. Obviously, we don't have precise estimates, we can't have them, but by cross-referencing various data, such as historical accounts, chronicles, customs, and traditions, several scholars have estimated a significant level of mortality. Each woman had a chance between 1 and 3% of dying during childbirth or from injury-related complications. For example, George Duby and Michel Perrault discuss this in A History of Women in the West, Keith Hopkins in The Population of the Roman Empire, and Judith P. Hallett in Roman Women. This estimate would therefore seem to contradict Moro, not only regarding the number of deaths, which we have seen was even higher just a few decades ago, but also regarding the very possibility that the species could be threatened by such events.
Because if we were talking about mortality rates of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or even 10%, then from an evolutionary point of view, it would actually be something very unusual.
Leaving aside the fact that there's a huge difference between 1% and 10%, and I would be more cautious about throwing out random numbers, it's obvious that in the past, mortality was much higher. And to get a clue that this was the case, it would be enough to have read some novels from the 1800s or the early 1900s where this event is often mentioned. Not to mention that those who are older and listening to us have surely heard the story of a grandmother, an aunt, or an acquaintance who died during childbirth, or from complications related to it. This shows just how common such an occurrence was. Now, if we wanted to use the same method that Moro used to delegitimize Ragusa's words, we could rely on this data and highlight how mortality has halved in just 30 years. We could cite the estimates that some researchers have derived from studying documents and findings from ancient Rome. But we won't do that, because the issue is actually much more complex and can't be reduced to this. We need to consider many other factors. What we can say is that in ancient Rome, mortality must have been much higher than it is today. So it's logical to assume that in prehistoric times it must have been even higher, and that comparing today's data with those from 200,000 years ago makes no sense at all. But Moro, in his eagerness to contradict, immediately makes another logical mistake.
In the last 30 or 40,000 years, the human population has constantly grown on Earth, even before the invention of hospitals, let's be clear, and yet every now and then, once in 1,000, the mother and the child would die. Yet the human population kept growing.
Clearly, this statement doesn't make scientific sense, because it would be like saying, we don't ask why the sun rises, since we see it rise every day anyway. Now we're sure that if the roles were reversed and we had said these things, Moro would have spent at least 20 minutes on this whole story. Let's leave it there and move to the next topic.
Finally, between 200,000 and 150,000 years ago, still in Africa, Homo
sapiens appeared. Now, we'd like to make a brief note about the dates that Moro disputes in our video, and we'll take this opportunity to tie all of this to a new topic. For example, Moro points out that our species appeared earlier than the dates we presented in the video. Specifically, we wrote that Homo sapiens appeared on Earth around 200,000 years ago, and Moro points out that there are recent discoveries that push this event back to as far as 300,000 years ago.
There are a couple of problems. One concerns the timing, in the sense that even here, these dates are now a bit outdated. Dates like 150,000 or 200,000 years ago are no longer very up to date. For example, in 2017, this fairly well-known study was published.
We also know the study that Moro mentions, but we simply chose to take a conservative approach, that is, to use certain and indisputable data that we all agree on. This is despite recent studies suggesting humans appeared even earlier.
This skull, which is practically Homo sapiens, dates to around 300,000 years ago.
To be precise, it should be added that it is true that recent fossil discoveries, such as those from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, may suggest that the first specimens of Homo sapiens date back to about 300,000 years ago. But the dating of 150,000, 200,000 years that we mentioned refers to a different and equally valid concept, that of the mitochondrial Eve, who is the most recent common ancestor from whom all current human beings descend through the maternal line. This, for example, is the page from the Treccani website. And if we take a look, we find written, the history of Homo sapiens dates back to 100,000, 200,000 years ago. At most, 300,000 depending on the definition of Homo sapiens that is adopted, and depending on whether the various fossils from this period are considered the last representatives of Homo erectus or the first of Homo sapiens. However, this objection is useful to highlight a fundamental concept that introduces a new and important element. We must always keep in mind that a study, no matter how accurate and verified, does not change the thinking of the scientific community. In order for this to happen, time and further studies are needed to confirm it, but Moro knows this very well. But most of the audience he addresses does not. So he knows that to contradict anything stated in the video, it's enough to find a study that says something different or that supports the hypothesis he wants to promote, and that's it. But a single study, a single piece of research, no matter how accurate, doesn't change anything at all in the scientific debate. This way of arguing is called cherry picking, a word that comes from English and metaphorically refers to the idea of picking only the best cherries from a bowl and deliberately ignoring the ones that are less ripe or of lower quality. If we think of the cherries as research studies, I can choose the ones that support my case and discard the ones that don't support it. In a field like the theory of evolution, where there are a lot of studies, let's think, for example, about the debate on the loss of body hair. The thinning and reduction of body hair. There are so many hypotheses, even conflicting ones, that can be used depending on the type of narrative you prefer to follow. Another important objection, Moro raises it when Ragusa brings up the topic of DNA in the discussion.
The difference between us and monkeys is just a few percentage points.
Then this makes me laugh because the differences between us and monkeys, well, it's true. We are monkeys. I mean, between us and the other monkeys. But anyway, that's just a matter of terminology.
But the terminological distinctions Moro is referring to are these.
I can kick ass, and he has gills like freaking fish.
Sorry for this brief interruption, but after witnessing yet another pointless clarification that always pursues the same goal, it's inevitable to wonder if the rigor in presentation demanded by Moro applies only to Ragusa, or if Moro instead enjoys a special free pass that allows him to express himself however he wants. Anyway, the discussion goes on, and the professor explains how small the difference is that characterizes human peculiarities if we look at DNA.
The difference between us and monkeys is just a few percentage points. 5% if we want to be particularly generous. And this 5% of differences from a phenotypic, morphological, functional, structural, physiological point of view and so on hide abyssal differences. And so, in fact, it has always been one of the concerns of genome scholars, of genomists, to understand what the genetic determinants are that make a human human and a monkey a monkey. Researchers' attention has shifted to another part of the genome called junk DNA, that is DNA.
So the idea is that over the years, people have looked at genes and genes are very similar. While the area is called junk DNA, that's actually a misleading term used in this context, because if we're talking about non-coding but regulatory areas, we can't really call it junk DNA, okay? But anyway, that's another issue. And here the interesting thing is that there's kind of this aura of mystery. We looked at the genes are very similar, but then if we look at the non-coding regions, we find huge differences.
At this point, it's not clear to us what he's surprised about. Moro says he doesn't understand what the professor means, but at the same time says he's wrong. At least that's what it seems, because he doesn't understand what the professor is saying. But honestly, we struggle to understand what Moro means, and especially what he's objecting to.
Most of the differences at the DNA level between humans and apes actually fall within the non-coding portion of the genome. The non-coding portion of the genome is that part of the DNA which doesn't contain information to produce proteins. And why is it so important? First of all, because many of the differences that were being looked for between humans and apes might be found there. There are numerous studies that suggest this, but there's more, because it's true that most of the genes that code for proteins in our species are shared with apes. So from a protein point of view, there doesn't seem to be much difference, but in reality, that's not the case. Because if we look at how the same genes in humans and apes are turned on and off, so how they are expressed during the embryonic development of our species, compared to the embryonic development of apes, we realize that the real differences are there. There we see more evident differences, the most noticeable differences, especially during the development of the brain. In other words, the same genes that apes have are also present in our species, but we activate them, we make them work. Let's put it this way, in a different way, more specifically at the level of the brain during its development. Also in adults, but especially during its development. And what is it that specifically turns genes on or off? It's precisely this non-coding portion of the genome. Most likely, the explanations for our humanity are found there.
Okay, are we good? Did you understand? The non-coding portion is where most of the differences are found, which lead to a profound difference in how genes are expressed, and therefore just like a... Okay guys, this applies to all animals. I mean, for all animals there are huge differences, sometimes in the coding regions, but sometimes in the non-coding but regulatory regions. Marco Ragusa is convinced that the non-coding regions, which he also studies in part, right? They exist only in humans, and that differences between non-coding regions are the rule among animals, or there is some mysterious intent. I don't understand the point of this aside.
Here we are witnessing the usual speculation about motives, and it would be interesting to understand what makes Moro think that Ragusa believes this is an aspect that concerns only human beings. Did you hear the professor say this? The professor is saying something else. That the differences between a man and a monkey, which have very similar genomes, are not only in the coding genes, but also in the non-coding ones. And that's where the real difference might be hiding. And what if we look at how the same genes between humans and monkeys are turned on or off during the embryonic development of our species compared to that of monkeys? We realize that the real differences lie in this, especially during brain development. The same genes that monkeys have are also present in humans, but we make them work differently during the stages of brain development. And what turns these genes on or off? It's precisely the non-coding portion of DNA. The reality, which anyone can verify by watching the video, is that Ragusa simply reported on an important discovery made in recent times. It has been observed that most likely what differentiates all living beings from one another are not the coding genes, as was once believed, but instead, it seems to be more related to the functions of that part of the genome that was once considered useless and was even called junk DNA. In fact, according to some evolutionists, junk DNA would have represented the proof of all the evolutionary processes that have taken place over the years.
Era quindi considerato
of waste material. Anyway, after about an hour, Giacomo Moro informs us that from this moment on, the best part of the video begins.
But please, this is the best part of this video, guys. This is where it starts. This is where it gets wild. So, up to this point, the video could have even been something acceptable, but from here on, it takes a very, very, very ridiculous turn. Okay? Are you ready?
At this point in the video, the professor explains to us how the brain isn't necessarily set up to make us more intelligent creatures. But we should consider it more like powerful hardware, which, however, without the right operating system, can't fully use its potential.
Our brain as an organ doesn't, how can I say, it's not genetically set up to make us intelligent creatures. More intelligent, let's say more intelligent than the rest of the animal world. It's not like that. It's as if it were very powerful hardware. It's like buying a supercomputer, then realizing there's no operating system when we turn it on, so we can't use it.
Moro quickly interrupts Ragusa and reminds us that this is his technique, saying it's not true that there's no operating system, but rather a more basic one.
So saying there's no operating system isn't completely true. The brain isn't a blank slate. It has heuristics. It has, simply put, we're particularly good at recognizing faces. As soon as we see them, we already have the ability to recognize certain physical laws automatically, like if we see an object when we're only a few months old or even basically newborn without having learned it, let's put it that way. These are some very famous experiments on this, both on humans and on chicks. They show that we already have, let's say, basic rules inside us. If we see a stone moving like horizontally, we immediately tend to. It catches our attention because we think that someone is pushing it, even without knowing. The laws of physics are, in a sense, hardwired into us. They are part of our heuristics. But that's fine. What you're saying is that our brain alone can't give us all our cognitive abilities. We need something else. We need training.
But as soon as he plays the video again, the professor's first words are these.
Genetically speaking, the operating system in our brain is activated, but it's very basic, very marginal, and it doesn't particularly distinguish us from the rest of the animal world. But then, when do we become so intelligent?
Even in this case, Moro's interruption was useless, because they were saying exactly the same thing. But even here, by breaking up the conversation, he repeated his technique, and above all, remember the words he started with.
That's not entirely true.
Then something unusual happens. Our video contains a typo. A graphic meant for another video appears. The sun reveals incredible alien worlds to us.
Suddenly the word neuroni appears on the screen.
And the death of other neurons in every cycle.
The sun reveals to us incredible worldliness? What the fuck? Well, I don't think it has anything to do with the topic, but okay, whatever.
He also talks about it in the last video he published a few days ago, and he's having a lot of fun.
The sun reveals to us incredible world aliens with brains full of galaxies inside. You get it? This is the context. It's never explicitly stated, but the context really contributes to making it a story like this. So much so that most of the comments are about that. Why am I specifying all this? Because it's important, come on, to look each other in the face and not fool ourselves.
Moro is absolutely right. What's important is to look each other in the face and not fool ourselves. So let's explain what happened. The editor, while putting together the timeline, accidentally included the text of a graphic that was meant for another video. Actually, the video that Sign refers to is this one, and it simply explains how the curvature of space caused by the gravity of the sun can be used as a gravitational lens to observe planets outside the solar system and hundreds of light years away. The term alien is only used figuratively to indicate the diversity of worlds that we might one day observe more precisely. This sign is actually a fascinating subject, and it's extremely entertaining. Moro actually reveals the cognitive bias about aliens on which the whole supposed reaction is based. He even goes so far as to see constellations inside the image of the brain, where he sees a hypothetical conspiracy or subliminal message that he skillfully reveals. What we recommend to Moro, since he has started the bunker, is to verify the deductions he offers to his audience. Because when this doesn't happen, at best you risk making a bad impression, and at worst, you risk getting into more serious situations. But what does all this have to do with Ragusa? The fact that a channel can also deal with investigating events, people, and theories at the limits of knowledge. It doesn't mean that those who are interviewed in a single work share all the ideas expressed in previous videos. Let's leave Moro to his preconceived ideas and clever deductions, but we invite him to be more cautious in expressing them. And now, let's continue with our video.
After the first 2 years of life, the connections between one neuron and another stabilize when the circuits are not used and when they are not used. When there is a lack of stimuli, these interneuronal connections die, and so do the neurons. This type of phenomenon is observed even more extremely in what are called feral children, that is, those children who, for one reason or another, were raised by animals when they were young. In that case, the stimulus these infants experience is, let's say, animal-like, and clearly the development. The type of stimulus is very limited, and their central nervous system develops in a very primitive way. Now, why all this, and what does it mean? Today, all of this seems very obvious to us. It's the foundation of pedagogy. These things I've told you are...
They are.
But hundreds of thousands of years ago, what kind of culturally rich stimuli could parents give to their children? Assuming that parents took care of their children, especially the mother, just as they do today.
Here, Moro seems to not really understand what the professor means. The example of the feral children, in fact, leads him to think that the professor is saying that primitive children lived like the feral children.
It makes absolutely no sense to think that once the young of our species or of the species before ours somehow lived like feral children. Like these individuals who were raised by animals, they were raised by other animals, sure, because we were still animals, but we had a culture, a certain cultural transmission.
But the professor didn't say that. He simply reiterated with an example that our brain needs certain stimuli, and without cultural stimuli, it can stop at basic functions, and that this wouldn't give it a significant advantage over all the other animals. And all of this is experimentally proven by studies on feral children.
The brain, therefore, is the organ that generated culture, but to function, it needs culturally shaped stimuli.
A sort of checkmate loop. Moro immediately interrupts the professor's speech and replies, saying that it doesn't make sense, because culture has evolved over time. And so at the beginning, people shared what they had learned.
There has been a continuous coevolution. Genes or brains? Culture. So in Australopithecines, there were some cultural aspects. Tools are made in a certain way, they are chipped in a certain way, you eat these berries instead of those, this is poisonous, this is not, be careful because that one will eat you while that one won't. If you go out during the day, make sure you don't get eaten by a lion. And gradually cultures became more complex as brains gradually grew. And so a new dimension grew, maybe a more social one, where it was also important to create groups. The dynamics between groups became particularly important. Individuals with larger brains found themselves with advantages, brains grew, and so did cultures, coevolution, genes, culture, coevolution, brains, culture.
So it's being implied that the professor thinks it's not like that. But actually, if we remember where he started from, his reasoning is only restating the idea that the first cultural stimuli might not have been enough to provide an advantage over the animal world in a highly competitive and dangerous environment. Not that they didn't exist. And at this point, the professor wonders when we can date culture. After saying that it's not easy to do so, he states that we could indicate a period around 40 to 50,000 years ago. At this point, Moro explodes, saying that the professor doesn't know what he's talking about and has no idea what culture is.
And here Professor Marco Ragusa clearly doesn't understand. He doesn't know what the concept of culture is. That is cultural transmission, the transmission of information. It's something that exists in other animals too. Culture. Dante, what a strange idea he has of culture.
Moro goes on to say that cultural transmission also exists among animals. He mentions a couple of examples, and that culture is passed down from generation to generation, and at most becomes more complex.
Which is actually the birth of culture, 40 to 50,000 years ago. But nobody really says that, at most 40 to 50,000 years ago. We find in Europe or in some parts of Africa the first, let's say, evidence of drawing. But that's not the beginning of culture. Before that, maybe culture was expressed in other ways, with dances, with the transmission of techniques, with the development of tools. We have it very clear. For 3 million years, we see different lithic cultures that change over time, starting from 2 million years ago. And that is culture that is passed down from generation to generation.
Moro, then, seems to have exposed the professor's ignorance. But let's get back for a moment to Ragusa's line of reasoning. Where were we? He was explaining how the lack of cultural stimulation made the brain less efficient. And he mentions that the period between 40,000 and 50,000 years ago was when, instead, we might have started to see evidence of a more advanced use of our brain. Certainly, the birth of culture can be traced back to the first social activities of human beings, but 40,000 years ago.
È quel periodo che solitamente...
Conventionally regarded as a true turning point in human history, this period is so significant that it is called the Great Leap Forward. In those years, we witness a surprising acceleration of complex cultural behaviors. It is then that the first forms of cave art emerge, increasingly refined stone tools are created, and even rudimentary musical instruments appear. Moreover, traces of elaborate burials, totems, and symbols indicate the development of spirituality, probably also linked to a more complex use of language. These are well-documented facts recognized by the scientific community, Clearly, this does not mean that everything happened suddenly, but only that during this period there was an acceleration in the development of complex cultural behaviors and symbolic expressions. So, a deeper use of our cognitive abilities. The professor was referring to these higher abilities because that was exactly the topic of the lecture. And he reiterates this shortly after, when he states that at the dawn of our species, our ancestors had a brain they couldn't fully use.
I imagine these first representatives of our species 200,000 years ago. If we want to go a bit further back, it's true that they had this big head, but they didn't have... How can I say this? They had a very basic software build, so they couldn't use it. Not only could they not use it, but it also gave them an attitude and intelligence that certainly wasn't high-performing if we look at it on a global level. This phenomenon is as though nature, hundreds of thousands of years ago, had selected for an organ that caused us a lot of problems. As we discussed earlier, we would only use it to its full potential hundreds of thousands of years later. This, from an evolutionary point of view, is a very strange thing, because nature is very pragmatic in its ways. It prefers the egg today over the hen tomorrow, and nature doesn't plan ahead. When the organ in question actually increases your lethality...
So we have two possibilities, right? This can't be the story, so either the story is wrong or aliens A or B. A o B?
A quanto pare Moro, in modo sfottente, risponde che l'unica soluzione alla questione posta dal professore siano gli alieni. Il professore invece pone sul piatto una delle tante risposte che ufficialmente vengono poste a questo quesito.
In this case, we can talk about sexual selection. So we have to imagine that our ancient ancestors preferred to mate with people who had this big head. Even though these people weren't particularly more intelligent than the others.
Moro interrupts the professor, stating that sexual selection cannot be ruled out.
What were the forces that favored brain growth? There are various hypotheses. The most likely one is the so-called social brain hypothesis, which says that in a social environment, being just a bit smarter than average is rewarded. Because it allows you to seduce the female, so it's sexual selection, but also simply to gain advantages over other individuals, right? Simply convincing them to go to war in your place.
But is being more intelligent really rewarded? This is just a hypothesis, because in a social environment, greater intelligence is not always an advantage. Other qualities can be rewarded, for example, in an insecure environment, for immediate survival. Even though intelligence can help in developing tools and techniques, physical abilities like strength and endurance can give an immediate advantage for survival, and the ability to protect offspring could be more decisive than intelligence. In other words, intelligence has to contend with the environmental and social context, and it is not always decisive. On the other hand, if we look around today, the world doesn't seem to be in the hands of the most intelligent. Anyway, let's move on. It's still important to recognize that this point is debated. The discussion shifts to another peculiarity of humans, neoteny, which is the phenomenon where even in adulthood, a species retains childlike characteristics. The professor states that neoteny is not so widespread in nature and gives an example. In this case as well, Moro makes some clarifications and begins listing plants and animals that show neotenic traits, stating that neoteny is very common in nature.
I searched for neotenic on Google Scholar to see how many results come up, and there are 11,500 results. They're not about domesticated animals. Here there's a discussion about salamanders, here it's about chimpanzees, and here it's about humans. So that's perfect. Here within a group of plants, and here also another group of plants. Here we are talking about another group of lichens, here another group of amphibians. Okay, here is a species related to the axolotls.
What Moro doesn't add, however, is that there are different types of neotenes: partial, complete, facultative, permanent, inducible, or obligate permanent. Lumping everything together is a generalization made with the clear intention of stirring up confusion. Furthermore, in plants, it's a phenomenon that resembles neoteny in our species. But in our case, neoteny is permanent and obligate. While in the axolotl, for example, transformation into an ambystoma occurs when we add thyroid hormones to the water. The discussion goes on and shifts to the fact that domesticated animals show neotenic traits, and humans also display them, a topic the professor says even Darwin knew about. The discussion continues by comparing our species to Neanderthals, highlighting how sapiens have neotenic features. And in addition, it is pointed out that our species shows traits typical of a species that has undergone a process of domestication. Here, the professor poses a provocative question that, at this point in the discussion, anyone could have asked, has our species been domesticated by someone?
This embarrassing question is answered with something rather complex to understand, which is self-domestication. Self-domestication is a sort of, how can I say, a revisiting of that phenomenon we talked about earlier, that is sexual selection, also associated with social selection. So what is social selection? It's about within a group or tribe preferring those individuals who are less aggressive, the more docile ones, the gentler ones.
The professor explains how sociability and sexual selection can be a response, meaning that animals with gentler traits have been selected, and even Moro seems to agree.
And it makes sense that more prosocial animals can simply have advantages over the more antisocial ones. Simply put, they can manage to cooperate better with individuals of the same species and therefore form alliances, and this can give huge advantages. It's natural selection. It goes against natural selection. A jerk, a bully, maybe he seems stronger, but two more gentle individuals can easily cause problems for a more aggressive one. It's pretty logical, it's something that can happen, and if gentleness is also linked to some morphological traits that maybe lead to a flatter face or things like that, well, these genes will spread. Isn't that idea pretty reasonable?
The professor goes further, saying that we have to consider that we're not such gentle animals because we're the only animals that wage war. Obviously, Moro takes the opportunity to show how other animals also wage war. The clarification is true. Many animals display behaviors that we can easily compare to war. But it is equally true that the kind of war we humans are capable of, thanks to those abilities we have understood to have developed over time, has characteristics and peculiarities that set it apart from that of animals. But this reflection is of little importance to the path we are taking. What is more relevant to our discussion is what Moro says shortly after.
What is at stake here is this matter of aggressiveness, of war, but it has nothing to do with where social selection operates. Where can more docile, more prosocial individuals be rewarded? It's within the social reference groups inside the tribe. One of the characteristics of our species, but also of other monkeys, is that we have a strong in-group, out-group mechanism. We're particularly prosocial and altruistic toward our own group, often the family, though sometimes that can extend to the tribe. And then particularly aggressive towards those we don't recognize as part of our social group, as one of us, in a certain sense. Think about it for a second. Cooperation and competition between groups are not two mutually exclusive things. In fact, often competition occurs between groups. It limits cooperation within one's own social group.
However, this hypothesis does not take into account competition within a group. It simplifies things and assumes that internal dynamics are not that relevant. For example, it doesn't mention hierarchy. It doesn't take into account the struggle for leadership, or all those social and environmental factors that can challenge this hypothesis. From the lack of resources, from sexual competition, which is often brutal and physical, to environmental and social pressures. On the other hand, it's not a general rule. Not all social animals develop neotenic traits. Even in this case, we have hypotheses that are more or less correct, and neoteny can be the result of several factors, not just a single element. So to sum up, we can say that those traits humans share with domesticated species may have been selected for various different reasons. Sexual selection, prolonged brain development, favoring learning and social adaptation, and cooperation. These are more or less some of the hypotheses. At this point, Ragusa picks up the thread of the discussion again, And after discussing the orthodox hypotheses about why humans have these traits typical of domesticated species, he wonders if all this can be explained by the presence of a selecting agent. But something strange happens right from the start. Moro attributes the idea to an alien intervention, but the professor dismisses the idea of an intervention by a selecting agent because he considers it a fringe theory that cannot be proven.
But there are some possibilities we could bring up without having to resort to, let's say, some kind of fringe theory. It became domesticated. It was domesticated unknowingly because it found itself near or inside closed, protected structures. It's a type of domestication that involves a domus, which is where the term protected, enclosed domestication comes from. An enclosure. This has been addressed, and that's one point. In some way, why? Why isn't it? If we look at it from this point of view, all these strange, bizarre, counter-evolutionary traits of our species could be contextualized. Because, let's be honest, the fact that we're hairless, the fact that we have such prolonged childhoods, the fact that we have such painful and risky births, so, if we put them in a protected, closed environment, then they can, let's say, they're compatible with the survival of the species. All those issues with these traits that somehow put us at a disadvantage when dealing with other species, whether prey or predators. So, if we imagine all this inside a domus, whatever the domus is, okay, I'm not going into the details of the domus, then yes, they can develop.
So the professor is proposing the idea that at a specific moment in history, our ancestors would have come across a protected area, sheltered from predators, and with favorable conditions. And this could explain how the difficulties of childbirth due to the large skull, the long parental care, the neotenic traits, and so on, did not affect its evolution. The professor clearly says that the point of his whole argument is this, that the peculiarities of humans could be explained by a naturally protected and particularly advantageous area.
In a closed environment, this makes sense. In a closed environment, even childbirth with obstetric care available makes sense. In a closed environment, it makes sense. It's possible, it's feasible to have a prolonged childhood as well, because it's a protected environment, so the young ones have nothing to fear. So, in my opinion, that's how the concept of domestication should be interpreted. That our species at a certain point, not our species, but those who came before us. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of years ago, possibly even Homo erectus. They found themselves, for some reason, in a closed, protected environment, within which they were able to develop adaptations that in nature, in a natural environment, in contact with other animals, could never have developed. Let's say this is more or less the conclusion of this whole discussion, all these oddities in the end. If we take them all individually, we put them inside an enclosure, because if I say domus, maybe it could be interpreted differently, right? We put them inside an enclosure, then yes, everything makes more sense. Then if you ask me, but what is this enclosure? But I don't know, this is a natural enclosure, it could be, I don't know.
Now surely Ragusa's hypothesis raises a lot of questions about how all this can be compatible with the discoveries of various fossils in Africa, about where this area could be, in what era all this happened, for how long, and so on. But our video ends here, leaving all these questions unanswered. In the book, these issues are explored in greater depth, and more answers and details are provided. But as we said at the beginning, we are not the professor, and we cannot and do not want to answer the questions in his place. We can only say that having known the professor's kindness, we are sure that if there had been a sincere interest in clarifying some points of his hypothesis, he would have been willing to engage in a debate and discussion. And this is what we don't understand. If Moro, as he claims in the video, has been following the professor for years, why didn't he invite him onto his channel to discuss the various points, as he has sometimes done with other guests? Why didn't he ask him those questions, which he might have considered important or crucial to disprove his hypothesis? What was the point? To criticize a simplified linguistic register, a few inaccuracies, and bring up aliens out of context? Addressing the more controversial topics would have been more useful, But that didn't happen. Actually, now something unsettling begins, after he reiterated that he has been following Ragusa for years, and that he has conducted investigations into him. Investigations that only confirmed how the professor is respected by the scientific community and considered well prepared by his students. He states that despite this, the professor must be prevented from expressing his hypothesis publicly.
In my opinion, you can't, in a way, let a university professor who is also paid with our money just go around on the internet to basically tell these things that are largely false, largely untrue, and that certainly contribute to giving a very different image of human evolution than what it actually is. So, in my opinion, this is something that needs to be said, needs to be done.
Like any good populist, when he has to start riling up the crowds, he brings up the issue of, and I pay for it. The dirty issue of money to make his censorship proposal acceptable. But he doesn't stop there. His is not just a consideration. At this point, he proposes a call to action to all the people of Catania.
So, it's up to you, if you're from Catania, if you're in any way affected by the presence of this professor. If you want to report this to your university, I won't do it, you do it, if you're interested. But, in fact, this is serious. It's serious that there are university professors who go and do this kind of thing.
Why does Moro stir things up and then wash his hands of it? If he wants the professor punished, why not do it himself? All these years he could have done it. He says he's been following him for a long time, so why hasn't he done it? No. Clearly, he wants something else. He wants the uproar. And so he urges his audience, more than 200,000 people, to make their voices heard. And so, let them grab their pitchforks. Let them lay siege to the University of Catania. Let them all shout together that the professor lives off our money, and therefore, he shouldn't be allowed to speak in public about his ideas. And the University of Catania must take action immediately. Professor Ragusa must be silenced. We don't know what Moro has in mind or what kind of measures he's proposing, whether he's hoping for disciplinary action or if his goal is even to get someone fired. But after urging everyone to take action, Moro opens his arms wide and shows magnanimity, saying he's open to a debate. But this openness lasts only a few seconds because right after, he makes it clear that he has no respect at all for the professor, and Ragusa's lack of preparation doesn't worry him, so he'll just silence him.
After that, I have no problem in this case with a debate. If Professor Marco Ragusa wants to have a public debate, I'm willing to do it too. Of course, you understand my respect for him is very low. Besides, I'm pretty sure I can have a debate even with him without any problems. Because what he discusses and how he explains it seem clearly and even somewhat ridiculously wrong to me. I have no problem with it. Just know I really don't have any issue with it.
Moro ends the video with these words.
Don't believe this stuff about the domestication of aliens.
As we've seen in this long analysis, the professor never talked about aliens. He answered our questions by dismissing the idea of the selector. But that's not enough for Moro. Moro reads Ragusa's mind, and so he keeps going on about aliens. Nothing, and no one will get it out of his head. Seeing what Moro calls a reaction, we realize that Entropy for Life took one of our videos from our channel using a method not provided by any YouTube tool. They didn't ask for permission. They played it in full. They didn't skip anything, even those parts that weren't useful to the discussion. And he's using all of this not so much to counter the professor's arguments, but to attack the person, trying to intimidate him to prevent him from exercising his freedom of expression, trying to hurt him in his work and professional life, and as a result, also in his private life. His words triggered thousands of people who immediately started insulting him and mocking his educational background, him personally, his role as a researcher. They even attacked him just for being Sicilian. Could we accept all this? Could we accept that our work would become a tool for these purposes? All right. All this led us to say that this is not just a simple scientific reaction. It's more than simple criticism of a hypothesis. But it masks a bitterness has little to do with science. After acknowledging the situation and its consequences, we decided that we would do everything possible to stop all this. Now, before starting the second part of the video and explaining to you in detail all the reasons that led us to consult a lawyer and to the process that was described in the last video published by Entropy for Life, allow us to make a general observation, which we consider very important and that can help clarify the roles within this whole affair. What we must always keep in mind is that every scientific theory tends to become a dominant paradigm, and sometimes this can represent a limitation for the advancement of knowledge itself. The philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn, in his book The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, shows us, for example, how scientific theories consolidate into paradigms that are accepted and defended by the scientific community, until anomalies emerge that the paradigm can no longer explain. When this happens, a scientific revolution may occur, leading to the adoption of new paradigms. In the case of Darwinian theory, natural selection, sexual selection, and genetic mutations form the main framework for interpreting evolution. But the risk is that these tools may not be sufficient, or may be the wrong tools for explaining all the complexities of life. If that were the case, we might be in a pre-revolutionary moment, where anomalies such as the origin of life, consciousness, or evolutionary leaps require a new, more comprehensive theory. The evolutionary theory has been based mainly on a reductionist approach. That is, it has tried to explain the complex phenomena of life by breaking them down into simpler parts: genes, mutations, selection, and so on. This approach has been very successful, but it could also represent a limitation. Therefore, a more holistic approach might be necessary to understand the complexity of evolution, but clearly this is just a hypothesis. I'll try to explain what we mean more clearly using an example. Let's imagine we have a hammer. Problem: everything will look like a nail to us. In the same way, the theoretical tools we have might make us see evolution through a specific filter, leading us to build hypotheses that seem coherent, but that might not capture the deeper truth. If the tools we use are somehow wrong or inadequate, we might keep producing explanations that are certainly believable, but that are not necessarily true. How can we tell when a paradigm is no longer sufficient to explain all the observations and anomalies? Science finds itself facing a moment of crisis, and it is in these phases that it is essential for alternative theories to emerge that try to respond better to the challenges that remain unresolved. With this, we are not saying that Professor Ragusa's hypotheses are the answer to all the unresolved questions within the theory of evolution, or that his hypothesis is the correct one. We are saying something else, and to understand what we mean, we need to understand the difference between a scientific researcher and a science communicator. The task of the science communicator is to translate the dominant and widely accepted scientific research into accessible language and convey those concepts to those who do not have the necessary tools to understand them. Among the tasks of a researcher, on the other hand, is to formulate hypotheses and research questions that challenge traditional models and to test them. This is the path a researcher takes to make new discoveries and advance knowledge: hypothesize, experiment, and verify. Possibly, the hypotheses formulated in the research will be unsuccessful, but this failure could still inspire another researcher who might find a more fruitful hypothesis. This is what Professor Ragusa, for example, does every day in the field of genetics, where he studies cancer cells and their DNA. And this is also what he proposes in his book, The Unnatural Man. In The Unnatural Man, Ragusa always remains within a Darwinian perspective, but he highlights the existence of certain problems, for which, although there are hypotheses that try to explain them, remember the example of the hammer, they are not completely satisfactory. So Ragusa does what he is used to doing every day. He tries to look at the issue from another point of view, and he proposes a different idea. All of this obviously has nothing to do with aliens, because the professor's hypothesis, as we said, still operates within a Darwinian perspective. Just because some supporters of the alien intervention hypothesis, like the often mentioned Moro, might find the professor's hypothesis useful for their own ideas, it doesn't mean that the professor shares all of Moro views. Those who follow our videos will remember that we talked about how the Big Bang Theory is seen by some creationists as proof of an act of creation initiated by God. Should science have rejected this theory just because it was also embraced by creationists? Obviously not. But remember, it was also questioned and opposed for this reason. So let's be careful when we set ourselves up as judges and defenders of science, while at the same time launching campaigns to repress the work of a researcher, especially if that researcher is a scientist who has proven his worth in the field of scientific research. Clearly, I expect that someone will take these words to the extreme, but I rely on the good sense of each of you. That said, I hope we've managed to get this concept across, so let's close this part and move on to the second part. And let's go back to the beginning of this story. We found out that the channel Entropy for Life had made a reaction video thanks to the numerous unkind comments that arrived on our channel shortly after the publication. After watching the video and taking note of the situation, we wrote a friendly email to Entropy for Life where we asked to be contacted by someone responsible for the channel because we needed to discuss some issues related to the video they had just made. We provided our contact information, including a phone number. We waited for a response that never came. So we tried to contact the person in charge of the channel through the comment section. We simply wrote that we had sent them an email and were waiting to be contacted. We didn't get a response and were banned from the channel. At this point, we realized that Entropy for Life had no intention of getting in touch with us. We weren't even considered worthy of an explanation for this whole operation. Disappointed by his behavior, especially on a human level, science, aliens, and evolution have little to do with it here. We take note that while he appears confident and bold on the web, in real life he refuses even a simple phone call to explain things, an email, or a message. In the meantime, as if it were perfectly normal, both our channel and Entropies are filling up with insults directed at us and at the professor. Both the professor and us are being accused of all sorts of things. The professor is clearly receiving the worst insults, but all kinds of things are being said about us as well. The most violent comments that are posted on our channel are deleted at first, and then we proceed to archive them. Among the comments that definitely made us smile the most, but which are indicative of the general trend, are those from people who accuse us, among other things, of having stolen the music used in the documentary from a famous podcast. So we find ourselves in a paradox, that we who paid for the rights to the music and images used, who paid for a crew and post-production, are still being called thieves. But this, as we were saying, is indicative and it's normal for it to happen. Anyone who knows how communication works is well aware that when you launch campaigns like this, word of mouth starts, leading to a public lynching, and you end up being accused of every possible wrongdoing. This escalation of insults and insinuations also happens towards the professor, and we notice with great regret that while we are putting effort into trying to moderate our channel by removing all those comments that go beyond what's allowed, instead we notice that the comments posted on the Entropy for Life channel, if they are positive or even slightly open towards us, are immediately opposed, sometimes even aggressively by 4 or 5 followers. We don't know if they are official moderators or not. While the negative comments, and by negative I mean defamatory insinuations, are tolerated and remain there undisturbed. We know it's not easy to moderate a YouTube page that suddenly gets 100,000 views in a few hours. But if you make a video like that, shouldn't you be aware of what will come? If you're even slightly responsible and want to prevent things from getting out of hand, you make arrangements to moderate, and you do it by using the channel's name to try to tone down the most unruly behaviors. But we've seen that this didn't happen, even though it's curious that our comment was banned after just a few minutes, while in the meantime, many other things remained posted. Anyway, after realizing that we wouldn't get any response from Moro or anyone on his behalf, let's take stock of the situation and analyze the reality of things. And basically, the situation we are facing is this. The channel Entropy for Life took our content, uploaded it in its entirety to their channel, presenting the operation as a scientific reaction video, and we assume they feel protected by fair use. In our opinion, there are no grounds for fair use in this operation, both for how the operation was technically carried out and for how our product was used, which became a tool to attack in a way that we do not consider correct. A third party, with whom, moreover, as is normal, we have a release agreement in which we declare that we will not carry out the kind of operations implemented by the Moro channel. Having acknowledged this situation, we contacted our lawyer and sent a cease and desist letter to the Entropy for Life channel. And since they never responded and did not feel the need to discuss it with us, we demanded that they remove our video from their channel within 3 days. If he wants to exercise his right to criticize us or the professor, he is absolutely free to do so, but he must not use our content. And here comes the real kicker. Moro presents himself as a victim of efforts to restrict his right to criticize. But this is obviously not true at all, because he refused any kind of discussion with us. Furthermore, let's remember that our documentary includes an interview in which Ragusa talks about his book. Nothing more. If Moro wants to talk about Ragusa's theories and exercise his right to criticize, he's not obligated to use our work. He can do it in millions of different ways, so no one is stopping him from anything. We're simply exercising our own right, the right not to see our entire product used. Not using our work in its entirety doesn't affect his right to criticize. It could have been a problem if we had held an absolute exclusive, like unique statements. But as we've seen, that's not the case. And Moro himself admits it when he says there are many other videos. Moreover, there is a book that he can freely buy where he will find much more than what was said in our video. And if he still wants to criticize our work, he can do so. He takes small pieces, uses editing techniques, but he certainly doesn't start a public screening. But be careful. There is another equally important point that led us to consider his reaction not in line with fair use, and made us realize that we could not and cannot tolerate all of this. Moro, by invoking fair use, takes advantage of the right to criticize, which the law allows in certain situations and under specific conditions. But it's still Moro, who at the end says the professor should be stopped from speaking online. But that's not all. The public's actions should also create consequences for him because of the way he speaks freely, even in his profession as a university professor. So we reach the paradox that Moro uses fair use, allowed by law in the name of freedom of criticism and opinion, to create a product whose purpose, according to Moro's last words, is to prevent another person from expressing their own ideas. This logical contradiction leaves us astonished, and it becomes yet another reason that pushes us to take legal action, in addition to the damage that his entire operation has caused to our work. We won't discuss damages here, as they'll be addressed in the proper venues. Another issue that we do not underestimate is calling a large audience to act against a single person. From experience, but also from statistics, we know very well that within a large audience there can be people with various issues, and for a variety of reasons they may react unpredictably. So we decide not only that we do not want our work to be used as a tool to censor an opinion, but we also want to prevent our work from being involved in situations that for any reason could undermine Professor Ragusa's safety. In the latest video published by Entropy for Life, we also heard Moro emphasize that our lawyer, in the warning letter, wrote to him that if he did not remove the video, he would face serious consequences, including the forced removal of the video and even the channel. That's absolutely true. But what, based on his words, might be interpreted as a threat actually isn't one at all. We simply warned him about the possible consequences he could face in order to make him aware of the situation. This is because our goal was not to harm his work. We know how much effort goes into every channel, and that was far from our intentions. To make him aware of what he could have been risking. The purpose of the warning, after all, is exactly this. You didn't want to reach an agreement, and you didn't want to get in touch with us. We are pointing out all the potential problems you might face. We don't understand why you're surprised. What were you expecting to read? You also accuse us of having written that your channel wasn't doing very well. But this isn't something we made up either. In the weeks and months before, you said you were disappointed with the channel's performance, so why be upset about this? Now let's talk about the famous ruling that came down last week, which in any case isn't really a ruling, but let's try to explain it. As we said before, we initially chose to request an urgent procedure and not an ordinary proceeding. An ordinary proceeding can last many years and involves 3 levels of review. The urgent procedure, on the other hand, is resolved in much less time, but it doesn't have the 3 levels of review. You can appeal within 14 days of the judge's decision and either go back to court or proceed with a regular procedure. This is because the urgent procedure is not final. It's a judge's ruling on a matter that needs to be resolved quickly without waiting for the traditional timelines of justice, but it isn't final. As many of you know, the judge decided to reject the urgent procedure and deny our requests, and we were ordered to pay the legal costs. Moro is obviously happy with this outcome, but unlike what he might think, we are also quite calm. However, his imaginative account of the legal case made us smile a lot, especially since we never saw him during the hearings. We only had the chance to meet his lawyer, who was actually a substitute. What may not be easy for everyone to understand is that the theories discussed in the documentary never even became part of the debate. We did not submit any documentation to defend the content of the video. This is because that was not the subject of the proceedings, and we were very struck by the judge's definition of bizarre. In fact, it's important to know that no expert was appointed, no technician analyzed the footage, and so we can't explain certain considerations except by the very nature of the urgent measure, which called for a quick judgment. Unlike Moro, we were present at the hearings. We also asked to be heard, but we were not allowed to speak for reasons that, honestly, we did not understand. Moreover, each hearing didn't last more than 5 minutes, so you can imagine what the reality of the situation was. We also found some bizarre elements in the judge's decree. For example, it says that our video was not shown in its entirety. It was definitely interrupted by his comments, but the video was shown in full, from the first frame to the last. Just like many other elements that we won't go into detail about because they could be subject to discussion in new proceedings. In any case, the motion was rejected, but what still surprises us today is Moro's reaction. We can understand his enthusiasm that leads him to repeat certain behaviors, but maybe he hasn't quite realized that this isn't a final verdict. Maybe he hasn't understood that we are still free to assert our rights, that we are reminding him that the video he took without authorization is causing harm, and it will limit the use we could make of it. This doesn't go away if an urgent measure is rejected. Maybe we weren't good at proving it the first time, but that doesn't mean the problem doesn't exist. And above all, we don't regret allocating part of the channel's budget because, beyond everything, we will always fight those who try to promote censorship campaigns, because we truly believe in freedom of criticism and expression. And if to uphold this essential principle for a democratic society, we have to go through 100 trials, we will do it. Because today a campaign has started to silence Professor Ragusa, tomorrow it could be against someone else. So, for the last time, we reiterate that Moro's criticism is not the problem, and he is free to express it under the law. And we are open to dialogue and discussion between the parties. And we invite him not to use this situation for battles that have little to do with the facts. For all our subscribers who follow the channel, we want to say that we will soon resume our usual programming and continue to investigate all those topics on the edge of knowledge that have fascinated us so much over these past months. Thank you all for watching this somewhat unusual video, but unfortunately, we were forced to make it.